When Nazi Germany launched its invasion of the Soviet Union on June 22, 1941, known as Operation Barbarossa, Benito Mussolini quickly decided that Italy should join the campaign. He wanted to prove that Italy was a powerful and loyal ally to Hitler's Germany. Within weeks, Mussolini ordered the creation of a special Italian force to send to the Eastern Front, the Italian Expeditionary Corps in Russia, known as the CSIR. This new force was made up of three main divisions: the Torino Infantry Division, the Pasubio Infantry Division, and the Principe Amadeo Duca d'Aosta Cavalry Division. By July 1941, the Italian troops began their journey toward the Soviet front. They traveled across Eastern Europe by rail and truck convoys, passing through Austria, Hungary, and Romania before entering southern Ukraine. The soldiers were full of confidence and national pride, but many had little idea of what awaited them on the vast and freezing Russian plains. The first clashes came in August 1941, when Italian units joined the German 11th Army in fighting Soviet troops retreating between the Bug and Dniester rivers. Despite limited equipment and outdated weapons, the Italians surprised even their German commanders with their discipline and bravery. In September 1941, during the Battle of Petrikovka, the Italian divisions managed to surround and capture more than 10,000 Soviet soldiers, seizing weapons, horses, and supplies. Their own losses were light compared to the size of the operation. Encouraged by this early success, the CSIR continued advancing eastward through the Ukrainian steppe, fighting small but fierce engagements almost every week. By October, the Italians were involved in the assault on Stalino, now the city of Donetsk, one of the key industrial centers in the region. They took part in heavy urban combat, clearing buildings and facing stubborn Soviet resistance. After weeks of fighting, Stalino finally fell to Axis forces, and Italian morale soared. In November, they moved on to Gorlovka, where they again fought street by street to drive out Soviet defenders. But as winter approached, the enthusiasm began to fade. The Italian troops were not equipped for the brutal cold of the Russian front. Their uniforms were thin, their supply lines stretched, and temperatures dropped to -30 degrees Celsius. In December 1941, the Soviets launched a large counterattack against the Italian Duca d'Aosta division. The fighting became known as the Christmas Battle. For days, the Italians fought desperately in the snow and mud, holding their ground against waves of Soviet attacks. Many soldiers froze in their trenches, and vehicles stopped running in the extreme cold. Despite these conditions, the Italians managed to repel the assaults with the help of German panzer units. By the end of the battle, more than 2,000 Soviet troops were dead, and the Italians had suffered around 1,000 casualties. By early 1942, the CSIR had already taken over 8,000 casualties since their arrival, but they had earned a reputation among their German allies as tough and reliable fighters. For Mussolini, this was proof that Italy had contributed meaningfully to Hitler's war in the East. The route the Italians took, through Austria, Hungary, and Romania, into the vast steppes of southern Ukraine, marked one of the farthest points Italian soldiers had ever fought from home in modern history. It was a journey that began with pride and ambition, but soon turned into one of hardship, suffering, and survival on one of the most brutal fronts of the Second World War. After the harsh winter of 1941, the Italian command decided to expand its presence on the Eastern Front. Mussolini saw Germany's early victories as proof that the war against the Soviet Union could still be won, and he wanted Italy to play a larger role. So in the spring of 1942, a much larger force was organized, the Italian 8th Army, known as the Armée. This new army included over 200,000 Italian soldiers, along with tanks, artillery, and support units. They were sent to reinforce German troops fighting along the Don River in southern Russia. But even before they reached the front, many soldiers were already exhausted. The trains that carried them were overcrowded, food supplies were short, and medical care was minimal. Still, the men sang songs and believed they would soon see victory. The route they followed stretched through the Carpathian Mountains, across the plains of Ukraine, and finally toward the Don. Thousands of trucks and horse-drawn wagons moved day and night, raising clouds of dust as they crossed endless fields of wheat. Locals watched in silence as Italian convoys passed through their ruined villages. Many civilians had already lost their homes to the earlier German advances. When the Italian Eighth Army finally arrived in the summer of 1942, it was placed under German command and assigned to protect a long section of the Don River, an exposed and vulnerable front line stretching over 200 miles. Their neighbors on the left were Hungarian divisions, and to the right were Romanian forces. All three armies were poorly equipped compared to the Germans, and few realized how disastrous this arrangement would become. During the summer, the Italians managed to settle into their positions. The front was quiet, and morale slowly improved. Soldiers built wooden shelters, planted small gardens near their trenches, and even organized football matches in the open fields when the fighting stopped. Many began to believe they might survive the war after all. Letters from home arrived regularly, and some units received supplies of wine, olive oil, and pasta from Italy. For a brief moment, life at the front felt almost normal. But in the distance, the thunder of artillery near Stalingrad was growing louder every week. The German Sixth Army had launched its massive assault on the city, and the Soviets were preparing to strike back. By late October 1942, the Italians began to notice more Soviet aircraft flying overhead, and scouts reported increased enemy movement across the river. The first real test came in mid-November when Soviet forces launched probing attacks along the Don. The Italian lines held at first, but the soldiers could feel the tension building. Then, on December 11, 1942, the storm finally hit. The Soviets launched Operation Little Saturn, a massive counteroffensive designed to crush the Axis armies along the Don and cut off the German troops fighting in Stalingrad. Thousands of Soviet tanks and infantry smashed into the Italian, Hungarian, and Romanian lines in the freezing snow. The Italian Eighth Army faced the full force of the Soviet winter offensive. The attack began before dawn, with waves of artillery shells exploding across the white landscape. Italian trenches vanished under clouds of smoke and fire. Communications were cut, and entire battalions were wiped out before they could even fight back. The few Italian tanks, mostly outdated models, were no match for the Soviet T-34s that tore through their positions. The soldiers fought bravely, but chaos spread fast. Snowstorms reduced visibility to almost nothing, and temperatures dropped to -40 degrees. Many soldiers froze to death as they tried to retreat. Units became isolated, surrounded by Soviet armor, and desperate radio messages went unanswered. In the following days, the Italian front completely collapsed. Thousands of men abandoned their positions, trying to find a way back west toward friendly lines. Roads were jammed with fleeing soldiers, broken trucks, and horses collapsing in the snow. The Soviets advanced relentlessly, cutting off escape routes one by one. Among the few units that managed to hold their ground were the elite Alpini divisions, mountain troops from northern Italy who were better trained and equipped for harsh conditions. They formed a defensive ring around their retreating comrades and fought continuously for over 2 weeks as they tried to escape encirclement. The retreat became one of the most tragic episodes in Italian military history. Soldiers marched for hundreds of kilometers through snow and ice, often without food, shelter, or ammunition. Many were killed in ambushes. Others died from frostbite or exhaustion. Those who survived described the journey as a nightmare of endless white fields filled with the dead.
By February 1943, the remnants of the Italian Eighth Army had been destroyed. Out of more than 200,000 soldiers sent to Russia, fewer than 60,000 ever made it back to Italy. The rest were either killed, wounded, or captured by Soviet forces. Back home, the news of the disaster shocked the Italian population. For the first time, Mussolini's propaganda machine could not hide the scale of the defeat. Families waited months or years for word from loved ones who never returned. Some soldiers who were taken prisoner did not come home until 1946 or later. long after the war had ended. For Italy, the campaign in Russia was both a political and human catastrophe. The decision to join Germany's Eastern War had achieved nothing but the loss of an entire generation of young men. It also marked the beginning of Mussolini's downfall, as confidence in his leadership began to collapse. Those who survived the retreat carried the memories for the rest of their lives. The frozen nights, the endless march through snow, the faces of comrades who fell behind and never rose again. Many veterans later said that the route to Russia had not just been a road of war, but a road of death and silence. The Italian route to Russia, from the sunny fields of Lombardy, across the Carpathian Mountains, through Ukraine, and finally into the frozen hell of the Don River, became a symbol of blind loyalty and tragic sacrifice. Even today, in small villages across Italy, memorials stand for the soldiers who never came back. They had set out in 1941 with songs, flags, and promises of glory. They returned, if they returned at all, in silence, broken, starving, and forever changed by the vast merciless steppe. When the Italian front on the Don River finally collapsed in early 1943, tens of thousands of soldiers who hadn't been killed or frozen in the snow were captured by Soviet troops. Exhausted, frostbitten, and starving, they were herded together by the Red Army and marched eastward into captivity. For many, this marked the beginning of another endless journey, one that would last not weeks or months, but years. The Soviet soldiers treated prisoners with suspicion. To them, every Axis soldier, whether German, Hungarian, or Italian, was an invader responsible for burning their villages and killing their people. The Italians, however, were often bewildered and frightened rather than hostile. Many had joined the campaign unwillingly, following orders from Mussolini's fascist regime. But that distinction made little difference to their captors. Columns of prisoners walked hundreds of kilometers through the frozen countryside toward collection points behind the Soviet lines. Those who collapsed on the way were left in the snow. Some tried to help wounded comrades, carrying them on makeshift sleds or sharing the last pieces of bread. But survival instincts soon took over. They were loaded into open train wagons, hundreds of men packed together in freezing temperatures with barely any food or water. The journey to the camps could take weeks, and many died before ever reaching them. When they finally arrived, the survivors found themselves in vast prisoner-of-war camps scattered across the Soviet Union. In Ukraine, the Urals, Siberia, and Kazakhstan. These camps were isolated, surrounded by barbed wire, guard towers, and endless wilderness. The conditions were harsh beyond imagination. Food consisted of a thin soup of cabbage or millet, sometimes just once a day. Medical care was almost non-existent. Diseases like typhus, dysentery, and pneumonia spread rapidly through the weak and malnourished prisoners. Winter temperatures dropped to -40, and most had no proper clothing or boots. To stay warm, prisoners wrapped themselves in blankets made of straw or tore their uniforms into strips. Every morning, bodies were carried out from the barracks. Men who had quietly frozen to death during the night. Out of nearly 70,000 Italian prisoners, more than 40,000 would never return.
And yet, within the misery, moments of humanity still appeared.
Some Soviet guards treated the Italians with a certain sympathy, perhaps because the Italians were often polite, religious, or simply too exhausted to resist. In some camps, Italian officers organized small schools and choirs, teaching basic lessons or singing songs from home to keep morale alive. Others carved religious crosses out of wood, sharing faith as their last comfort. As months turned into years, the world outside changed. In July 1943, Mussolini was overthrown in Italy, and the new Italian government secretly negotiated an armistice with the Allies. By September, Italy had officially switched sides. It was now at war with Germany. But for the prisoners in Soviet hands, nothing changed immediately. They were still deep in the USSR, far from any news or hope of rescue. When Soviet officers finally informed them that Italy was no longer an enemy, many prisoners wept. Some began cooperating with Soviet authorities, joining small propaganda groups like the Italian Red Army Committee, which broadcasted anti-fascist messages by radio to Axis soldiers still fighting. These broadcasts urged Italians to surrender and to rebuild their country free from fascism. By 1944 and 1945, as the tide of war turned decisively in favor of the Allies, a few thousand Italian prisoners were gradually released. They were sent to transit camps near Moscow, where they underwent political re-education. Many were given basic work, repairing roads, loading supplies, or helping rebuild destroyed villages. Those who refused to cooperate remained behind the barbed wire, waiting for years in silence. When World War II finally ended in May 1945, the survivors thought they would soon go home. But bureaucratic chaos and the devastation across Europe delayed their return. Stalin's government prioritized repatriating soldiers from other Allied countries first, and Italian POWs were among the last to be freed. It wasn't until 1946 and 1947 that most of them were allowed to return to Italy. The journey home was slow and painful. They traveled in freight trains across endless plains, through Poland, Hungary, and Austria, the same lands they had once crossed years earlier in the opposite direction, when the war had just begun. But now they were thin, quiet, and broken. When they stepped off the trains in Italy, families didn't recognize them at first. Mothers, wives, and children wept as they embraced men who looked twice their age. Many returned to find their homes destroyed and their country divided. Northern Italy was in ruins. Mussolini had been executed, and the monarchy had collapsed. The men who came back from Russia carried the burden of memory, the comrades lost, the hunger, the freezing marches through the snow. Some never spoke about it again. Others tried to write their stories, but few people wanted to listen. The new Italy was rebuilding itself and preferred to forget the war. In time, though, their sacrifice began to be remembered. Small memorials appeared in villages, often bearing the simple inscription, I caduti in Russia, to those who fell in Russia. Each one marked not only the tragedy of the men who died on the Eastern Front, but also the lesson of blind obedience to fascism. Historians later called the Russian campaign the most tragic military adventure in Italian history. It had begun with grand promises of glory, honor, and alliance with Germany, and ended in silence, defeat, and loss. The route to Russia became a road that led to nowhere, a frozen trail of suffering that still echoes in Italian memory. For the men who survived the steppes, the war never truly ended. Even decades later, they could still hear the sound of the wind over the snow, the crunch of frozen boots, and the whisper of the comrades who fell beside them. They had seen the limits of human endurance and the cost of political arrogance. Their story, from the sunny fields of Italy to the icy plains of the Don and back, remains one of the most haunting and powerful chapters of World War II. After the soldiers returned from the frozen plains of Russia, Italy itself was no longer the same country they had left behind. The once loud voice of fascism had fallen silent. The grand speeches, the promises of empire, and the dreams of glory had all turned to dust. What remained was grief, quiet, heavy, and everywhere. In towns and villages, black-clad mothers stood at train stations holding faded photographs of sons who would never come home. The defeat in Russia had been more than a military loss. It had shattered the myth of Mussolini's strength. Before 1943, his propaganda had convinced millions that Italy was destined for greatness. The images of columns of soldiers marching east, banners waving beside the German eagle, had been shown in every cinema. But when the truth came back, the stories of hunger, frostbite, and death in the snow, people realized how deeply they had been deceived. After Mussolini's fall and execution in 1945, the new Italian Republic faced the painful task of facing its past. Thousands of officers, fascist officials, and collaborators were arrested. Some were tried for war crimes. Others simply disappeared into the chaos of the post-war years. But the tragedy in Russia was treated differently. There were no heroes to celebrate, and no villains easy to blame. The soldiers who had gone east were seen as victims, not of the Soviets, but of their own government's arrogance. In the late 1940s, Italy was a country rebuilding from ruins. Cities like Milan, Turin, and Genoa lay shattered by bombing. The economy was broken, and people were hungry again, but this time for peace. Amid this reconstruction, stories from the Eastern Front slowly began to surface. Survivors published diaries and letters they had kept hidden during captivity. Newspapers printed accounts of the retreat across the Don, and radio stations began broadcasting interviews with the men who had walked through the snow and survived. One of the most haunting aspects of these stories was their tone. Not anger, not revenge, but a kind of quiet disbelief. Many soldiers said they still could not understand why they had been sent there in the first place. The campaign had achieved nothing. No land, no victory, no strategic gain. Only death. Historians later described it as a war Italy had fought simply to prove loyalty to Germany, and it had cost more lives than any other expedition in Italian history. The memory of the Russian campaign also changed the way Italians viewed war itself. For generations, war had been wrapped in ideas of glory and honor. But after the Don River, people began to see it as something dirty, cruel, and meaningless. This shift in national consciousness would shape Italy's politics for decades. When the Italian Constitution was written in 1947, it included a clear rejection of war as a tool of national policy. The ghosts of the soldiers who froze in Russia had helped write those words. In the early 1950s, as Europe slowly recovered, the Soviet Union began returning the last Italian prisoners who had survived the camps. Their return was emotional and public. Trains arriving at border stations filled with thin, silent men wearing Soviet uniforms and carrying small bags. Crowds gathered, waving flags, crying, singing old songs. These men were welcomed as symbols of suffering and endurance, even by those who had once supported Mussolini. But the full truth of what happened on the Eastern Front remained hidden for years. Many records were lost, and the Soviet archives stayed closed until the end of the Cold War. Only in the 1990s did historians finally gain access to detailed Soviet documents, confirming how catastrophic the campaign had been. It turned out that of the more than 200,000 Italian soldiers sent to Russia, barely 1/4 had returned alive. In small mountain villages in northern Italy, monuments began to appear. Simple stone markers with the names of local boys who had never come back. Each one told the same story in a different place. A young man sent to a distant land, swallowed by snow and silence. Memorial associations formed, not for victory, but for remembrance. Every January, survivors and their families gathered to light candles for those lost on the steppe. The light flickered against the cold winter wind, as if echoing the faint glimmer of life that once burned in those frozen nights. The political legacy was just as deep. The disaster in Russia had destroyed any remaining faith in fascism. Italy turned toward democracy, toward Europe, and toward peace. The nation that had once marched east alongside Hitler now became one of the strongest voices for unity and cooperation in the post-war world. When Italy joined NATO in 1949, it did so not to conquer, but to defend. A symbolic reversal of everything the fascist era had stood for. For the soldiers themselves, the memories never faded. Many kept small relics from their time in Russia. A spoon, a medal, a torn photograph. They would sit in cafes years later, telling their stories quietly to those who asked, and then falling silent again. Some never spoke at all. The pain was too heavy, the memories too sharp. But their silence spoke louder than any speech. As decades passed, filmmakers and authors began to revisit the campaign. Documentaries, novels, and poems tried to capture what those men had seen. One writer described the steppe as a sea of white that swallowed everything: soldiers, dreams, and nations. Another called it Italy's grave under the Russian sky. Even today, the route the Italians took, from Verona and Udine, across the Carpathians, into Ukraine, and finally to the Don River, can still be traced on old maps. Farmers in those regions sometimes find rusted helmets, buttons, and belt buckles buried under the soil. Each object is a small whisper from the past, a reminder of young men who traveled too far from home. The campaign in Russia remains a lesson carved into the memory of a nation, a story of pride turned to tragedy, of men abandoned by politics, and of a generation lost to snow and silence. It reminds us that behind every great ambition of war lies the quiet suffering of ordinary people. The Italians who marched east in 1941 believed they were making history. Instead, they became its warning. The world was silent. Smoke still rose from the ashes of cities that once thrived with laughter, families, and dreams. Europe was shattered, its people hungry, homeless, and broken. The war had ended, but the scars it left behind would last for generations. As the dust settled, the true horrors of what had happened began to emerge. When Allied soldiers entered concentration camps like Auschwitz, Dachau, and Buchenwald, what they saw defied all imagination. Piles of lifeless bodies, starving survivors with hollow eyes, the smell of death in the air. The Holocaust was no longer just a rumor, it was a horrifying truth. 6 million Jews, along with millions of others, Poles, Roma, disabled, political prisoners, had been systematically murdered by the Nazi regime. The world stood in shock. Humanity had reached its lowest point. The Nuremberg trials began soon after, where surviving Nazi leaders were held accountable for war crimes. For the first time in history, the concept of crimes against humanity was officially recognized. Justice, though delayed, had begun its course. But justice alone couldn't heal the world. Cities like Berlin, Warsaw, London, and Tokyo lay in ruins. Millions were displaced, searching for lost relatives, wandering through rubble, holding on to hope that maybe someone they loved had survived. The global economy was devastated. Food was scarce, and fear lingered in the air. Amidst this darkness, new powers began to rise. The United States and the Soviet Union emerged as the two superpowers, each with their own vision of how the post-war world should look. The Western nations, led by America, wanted democracy and free markets. The Soviet Union, under Joseph Stalin, spread its communist ideology across Eastern Europe. This ideological clash gave birth to a new kind of conflict, one without direct battles, but with global consequences: the Cold War. The same allies who fought side by side against Hitler were now looking at each other with suspicion. Berlin, once the heart of Nazi Germany, became the first front line of this new divide. The city was split, east controlled by the Soviets, west by the Allies. In the following years, the Berlin Wall would become a symbol of this ideological war, a physical barrier dividing not just a city, but the entire world. Meanwhile, in Asia, Japan's surrender marked not only the end of war, but also the beginning of a massive transformation. Under American occupation, Japan rebuilt itself, not as a military empire, but as a peaceful, technologically advanced nation. Germany, too, was divided. East Germany under Soviet control, and West Germany under Western influence. Both nations, once symbols of aggression, slowly turned into models of recovery and innovation. But while the world moved forward, millions continued to live with memories they could never escape. The survivors of the Holocaust carried invisible wounds. Soldiers returned home changed forever. Entire generations grew up in a world haunted by what their fathers had seen and done. Technology had taken a leap during the war. Jet engines, radar, and nuclear energy, all born out of destruction, now shaped the future. Science had shown its potential for both progress and annihilation. The same intelligence that split the atom for energy also split it for bombs. Humanity stood at a crossroads, to destroy or to rebuild. The United Nations was formed in 1945, a global institution meant to prevent such wars in the future. Nations came together under one flag, vowing, never again. They believed that through dialogue, diplomacy, and cooperation, peace could prevail. But peace is fragile, and history has shown that it must be guarded constantly. World War II changed everything. It redrew borders, ended empires, created new nations, and defined the 20th century. The British Empire collapsed, giving rise to independence movements across Asia and Africa. India, Indonesia, and dozens of other nations began their journeys toward freedom. The world that emerged after 1945 was no longer ruled by a few. It was shared by many. Yet, even in victory, humanity paid an unbearable price. Over 70 million lives lost, cities turned into dust, families erased. But from that destruction came lessons about power, greed, unity, and the value of peace. Even today, decades later, we study World War II, not just to remember the battles, but to remember the people, the innocent who suffered, the brave who fought, and the leaders who made choices that changed the course of history. It remains the darkest chapter in our past, but also the one that taught us what it truly means to be human. Because in the ruins of war, humanity rebuilt itself, and that, perhaps, is our greatest victory. After the physical battles had ceased and the guns were silenced in 1945, the real war of reconstruction and memory began. Europe lay in ruins, cities flattened, factories dormant, millions displaced. In Germany alone, over 60% of housing in some cities had been destroyed. In Cologne, Dusseldorf, and many more, the devastation was near total. Transportation networks were shattered, power grids down, communications disrupted. The first task was simply survival. Food, shelter, basic utilities. As one historian wrote, the networks connecting these factories were wiped out. Power grids needed major repairs. Water systems didn't work. Communication lines just stopped. In the Soviet-liberated sections and in Eastern Europe, the scale was still more catastrophic. Poland and Czechoslovakia lost 10 to 20% of their populations between 1939 and 1950. Cities like Wrocław and Warsaw had historic centers destroyed. Rebuilding required not just bricks, but new political will. Meanwhile, Western Europe appealed for aid. In 1947, the Marshall Plan, or European Recovery Program, was launched by the United States, with more than $13 billion in aid across 16 countries. Italy, among the beneficiaries, received funds which helped stabilize its economy and society after the wartime devastation. The plan also marked the beginning of the Cold War, as the Soviet sphere refused participation and instead built its own system of economic integration. Germany became the classic case study of post-war reconstruction. Between 1945 to 1949, the country faced a near-complete breakdown of civil infrastructure. Millions homeless, no central government. Food rations reduced to near-starvation levels in the British zone. At one point, only 1,000 calories per day. Yet, within a decade, West Germany experienced what came to be called the Wirtschaftswunder, or economic miracle. Reform of currency, the Deutsche Mark, removal of price controls on June 21, 1948, and tax cuts. All these policies laid the foundations for rapid industrial recovery. Japan, too, in Asia, suffered extreme bombing. 66 Japanese cities were heavily bombed. Tokyo saw 65% of residences destroyed. Osaka, 57%. Under the Allied occupation, reforms such as land redistribution, dissolving of large industrial conglomerates, and adoption of democratic institutions took place. Japan's recovery eventually rose on foundations of industrial exports, low-cost manufacturing, and a skilled workforce. Reconstruction was not only physical but social. Governments expanded welfare states, retrained workers, built housing and social infrastructure. In Britain, for example, major nationalization and welfare reforms shaped the immediate decades after the war. The war's legacy on trust in institutions and community cohesion remains visible even decades later. Among people whose families suffered wartime victimization, trust in government and institutions is significantly lower. Within the scientific and academic spheres, American influence became transformative in Europe. Foundations helped rebuild Europe's scientific institutions, promoting free research in physics and biology under Western influence. Meanwhile, cities themselves were being rebuilt. In Frankfurt, for example, the rubble was gathered and recycled via special municipal efforts. By the mid-1960s, the visible remains of wartime destruction had been largely cleared. Urban planners often chose modern architecture rather than simply restoring old styles. In Wrocław, Poland, more than 70% of the city was in ruins. Its reconstruction reflected both new political borders and new architectural paradigms. In Italy, the echo of the Russian campaign, the one we discussed earlier about the Italian troops on the Eastern Front, added an extra layer to the nation's reconstruction story. Many returning soldiers came home wounded, frozen, scarred. Their memories were heavy, the loss of young men a burden on communities. The war had shifted Italy's direction, from fascist ambitions of empire to a republic oriented toward democracy, European integration, and rebuilding. The Italian Constitution of 1947 explicitly rejected war as a tool of national policy, an echo of the blood-soaked lessons learned in places like Russia and the Don Front. On the level of memory and identity, the struggle to come to terms with the war's aftermath continues. Monuments, memorials, and collective remembrance persist, but equally, contested narratives emerged. Disputes over national culpability, collaboration, and victimhood continue to shape European memory. Economically, the global order shifted dramatically. The British Empire collapsed, and colonial territories in Asia and Africa pressed for independence. The war had drained European powers and stimulated new political movements for self-determination. The world after 1945 was no longer one of empires, but of new nations and new alliances. Technologically, the war had accelerated advancement. Jet engines, radar, nuclear power, all born from wartime efforts, now entered civilian life. Science had shown not only its productive potential, but its destructive power. The same atomic bomb dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki remains a symbol of that duality. The war's end did not mean the end of technological revolution. Politically, the emergence of the United Nations in 1945 marked an attempt to build global structures aimed at preventing another world war. Many of the members soon found themselves locked in a different kind of conflict, the Cold War, which pitted the United States and the Soviet Union in a global ideological struggle. Europe became a chessboard of influence. West aligned with the US, East with the USSR. Berlin, once the heart of Nazi Germany, became the front line of the new conflict. The Berlin Wall would eventually symbolize that division. For Italy specifically, after the defeat in Russia and Mussolini's fall, the nation faced a painful transition. The rebuilding was both material and moral. The soldiers who returned carried deep physical and psychological scars. Their memories and traumas weighed heavily on families and communities. The nation's post-war choices, republicanism, European integration, social reform, must be seen in light of these personal and collective costs. The years after 1945 were not only about rebuilding roads, factories, and governments. They were about rebuilding meaning. The war had shattered not just buildings, but belief systems. Entire generations questioned what civilization meant after Auschwitz and Hiroshima. Artists, writers, and philosophers grappled with guilt, silence, and survival. Europe, once the cradle of enlightenment and modernity, found itself haunted by its own capacity for destruction. In Italy, the process of moral reconstruction became inseparable from the creation of a democratic identity. The fall of Mussolini had left behind a vacuum not just of leadership but of faith. Italians, who had once been mobilized under fascist slogans of glory and empire, now searched for purpose in rebuilding, cooperation, and civic responsibility. The Constituent Assembly of 1946-47 drafted a constitution that banned fascism, enshrined individual rights, and placed sovereignty firmly in the hands of the people. The Republic's early decades were marked by intense debates about justice, what to do with collaborators, how to remember the victims, and how to prevent tyranny from returning.
Meanwhile, across Europe, the idea of collective guilt and collective responsibility became central. In Germany, the process known as denazification was uneven and painful. Allied occupation authorities attempted to purge Nazi influence from institutions. But in practice, many technocrats, engineers, and civil servants of the old regime were quietly reinstated in the 1950s. Yet something deeper changed. Younger generations, born after the war, demanded moral reckoning. By the late 1960s and 70s, German students confronted their parents' complicity in the crimes of the past, reshaping national consciousness. The Holocaust had left an unhealable wound on Europe's soul. In the ruins of concentration camps, survivors struggled to rebuild lives and communities. Many emigrated, to Israel, to the Americas, while others remained, determined to bear witness. The trials at Nuremberg set precedents in international law, defining crimes against humanity, and asserting that obedience to orders was no defense. Justice was partial but symbolic. It established that moral responsibility transcends national loyalty. In Eastern Europe, Reconstruction unfolded under a different star, the red one of communism. Stalin's USSR imposed its political model across the territories liberated by the Red Army. Land reform, nationalization, and central planning reshaped economies from Poland to Hungary. The human cost, however, was immense. Political purges, censorship, and the suppression of dissent created new forms of fear. Yet even within that system, nations rebuilt. Literacy soared. Industrial output expanded. Cities rose again from rubble. In Warsaw, the old town was meticulously reconstructed from pre-war paintings and blueprints, becoming a symbol of cultural defiance and rebirth. The Cold War split the European psyche in two. The Iron Curtain was not only a political boundary, but a mental one, dividing families, art, science, and imagination. Western Europe rebuilt under the promise of prosperity and consumerism. Eastern Europe rebuilt under the promise of equality and collective progress. Both sides told their people that history was on their side. In Western Europe, the Marshall Plan's success created a shared sense of destiny. The idea that economic cooperation could prevent war led directly to the formation of institutions like the European Coal and Steel Community in 1951, the embryo of what would later become the European Union. Economic interdependence replaced nationalism as the foundation of peace. Borders, once lines of hatred, began to blur under the flow of goods, people, and ideas. Socially, the war had transformed families and gender roles. Millions of men were dead or disabled, and women who had filled factories and offices during wartime refused to return silently to domesticity. In Britain, France, and Italy, women's movements pushed for suffrage, labor rights, and education. The image of the war widow and the woman worker became powerful symbols of endurance and change. Reconstruction thus had a gendered face. Homes, schools, and hospitals rebuilt by hands that had learned to endure loss and rebuild life. Culturally, the ruins became metaphors. In post-war literature and cinema, rubble-filled streets symbolized shattered moral order. Italian neorealism emerged. Films like Rome, Open City, and Bicycle Thieves portrayed ordinary people struggling to survive amid ruins. These films rejected escapism and instead embraced truth, compassion, and humanity. Similarly, in Germany, Trümmerliteratur, rubble literature, chronicled the psychological aftermath of war.
Writers like Heinrich Boll and Wolfgang Borchert explored guilt, silence, and moral emptiness in a world trying to remember how to live. In art and philosophy, existentialism rose from the ashes. Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus articulated a Europe disillusioned by ideology and power. "Man is condemned to be free," wrote Sartre, meaning that after the fall of faith in systems, each individual must take moral responsibility. Camus' concept of the absurd hero, who continues to act ethically even when the world makes no sense, became emblematic of post-war thought. Meanwhile, across Asia and Africa, another wave of reconstruction was taking shape. Decolonization. The war had exhausted European empires and exposed the hypocrisy of colonialism. Soldiers from India, Algeria, Nigeria, and Vietnam, who had fought for freedom under Allied flags, now demanded that same freedom at home. Between 1947 and 1975, most of Asia and Africa gained independence. India's independence in 1947 was a signal event, proving that empire could end through political movement rather than apocalypse. But not all transitions were peaceful. Indonesia, Algeria, and Kenya witnessed bloody wars of liberation. The moral vocabulary of reconstruction thus expanded, from rebuilding cities to rebuilding justice. The United States and the Soviet Union became global superpowers. Their competition was not only for weapons and territory, but for hearts and minds. The Cold War saw reconstruction turn ideological. Who could promise a better modernity? In the West, consumer goods, automobiles, and television symbolized freedom and progress. In the East, massive public housing projects, universal education, and industrial growth symbolized socialist triumph. The arms race, space race, and propaganda wars defined the age. Yet beneath the rivalry, humanity experienced a shared transformation. The technological revolutions born from wartime research, computers, nuclear energy, aerospace engineering, reshaped daily life. The transistor, developed in 1947, would revolutionize communication. Within 2 decades, satellites circled the Earth, and by 1969, humans walked on the Moon, a journey unthinkable before the war. The same science that had created destruction now promised transcendence. In Europe's classrooms, a new lesson was taught: peace through understanding. Textbooks were rewritten, history reframed, and cultural exchanges fostered. The Council of Europe, founded in 1949, and UNESCO, promoted reconciliation through education. Generations born after 1945 grew up not as subjects of empires, but as citizens of a shared continent, divided politically, yet increasingly connected culturally. The post-war welfare state also reshaped the relationship between citizen and state. Governments introduced universal health care, pensions, and unemployment benefits, seen not as charity, but as rights earned by collective sacrifice. In Britain, the National Health Service became one of the great moral legacies of the war. Across Scandinavia and Western Europe, the idea of social citizenship took root, that a stable democracy must guarantee security and dignity to all its citizens. Italy's transformation in the 1950s and 60s was particularly striking. From the ruins of fascism, the nation experienced rapid industrialization, known as the Italian economic miracle. Cities like Milan and Turin became centers of manufacturing and design. Fiat cars and Olivetti typewriters became global icons of post-war modernity. But beneath the prosperity, social tensions brewed between North and South, tradition and modernity, church and state. The reconstruction of Italy was not merely economic. It was an ongoing negotiation of identity. By the late 20th century, the generation that had known the war was fading, but its shadow lingered. Memory politics became part of governance. Commemorations, museums, and anniversaries shaping how nations understood themselves. Debates over monuments and national guilt continued to stir passions. Who was victim? Who was perpetrator? Who had the right to remember? The Holocaust Memorial in Berlin, the Peace Museum in Hiroshima, the rebuilt Warsaw Old Town. Each became a statement that memory itself was part of reconstruction. Globally, the moral and political lessons of post-war reconstruction gave birth to international institutions that continue today. The European Union, the United Nations, the IMF, and World Bank. The dream was that interdependence would prevent another global war, and, despite crises and tensions, that dream largely held. Europe, once a battlefield of empires, became a zone of peace. Not through conquest, but through cooperation. By the dawn of the 21st century, the landscapes of war had been transformed into landscapes of memory. Where tanks once rolled, tourists walked. Where factories once made weapons, they produced cars, electronics, and art. The scars remained, sometimes visible in architecture, sometimes invisible in the psyche, but they were no longer wounds. They were reminders. In the end, the reconstruction after 1945 was not just a rebuilding of walls and wires. It was a reconstruction of values, of what it means to be human after the collapse of humanity. It taught the world that peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of justice, memory, and moral courage. The cities rose again, yes, but so did ideas, compassion, and a shared determination that the ruins of yesterday would never again become the blueprint of tomorrow.